According to the World Bank data, in 2020, there were 3.7 million under 5-year-old girls in Vietnam, compared to 4.1 million boys of the same age group. The difference is 5.5%. If true, this is a highly unusual gender demographic discrepancy, and it should be a matter of consequence both publicly and privately, from social service, healthcare, education, to economic activities such as consumer product development and marketing. It should be a concern for anyone responsible for Vietnam's well-being. Extraordinary data warrant extraordinary scrutiny. Are the data really credible? This presentation is about this issue, and there will be suggestions at the end for those who are in a position to check it out. This chart plots the population of Vietnam boys and girls under 5-year-old from 1960 to 2020. There is a long steady baby boom phase, a baby bust phase in mid-1990s, and what is most noticeable, a phase of increasing difference between boy and girl populations since mid-2000 decade. The sudden change in gender disparity is even more pronounced on the relative scale. This chart shows the percentage of girl and boy population difference over time. It had been steady around -2.5% for 4.5 decades, then suddenly shifted to around -5.5% for the last 10 years. The questions are, is it really true, how, and why? Does it have anything to do with this baby boomlet generation? But first, is this normal? To find out, one can compare Vietnam with other countries. The Vietnam data are compared with those of Japan, US, Germany, Singapore, and Philippines. Japan, US, and Germany represent three most developed societies on three continents, with the highest credibility in terms of social and demographics data. None of those countries is known for any gender selectivity of its offspring. Singapore is selected as it has a large Chinese ethnic composition, whose culture may have a preference for males, and whose data are credible as it is a small state and a highly developed society. Philippines is selected as its population, like Japan and Singapore, are genetically close to the Vietnam population, and more importantly, because of its dominant religion, namely Catholic, abortion in general, much less the abortion of female fetuses, is outlawed, highly restricted, and untolerated by the society. The data show that this Vietnam problem of large girl-boy disparity for under 5-year-olds is anything but normal. Notice how up to 2000, Vietnam and Germany data were quite similar, then came a sharp drop for Vietnam. Even Singapore, which has three-quarter Chinese majority, simply fluctuated between highs and lows, and only occasionally dipped to -3.5%, while Vietnam went beyond -5.5% for almost a decade. The disparity is for all children under 5-year-old. Could there be a nutritional or illness problem affecting girl mortality rate more than that of boys? We can look at the data for the newborns. Again, the data for US, Japan, and Germany are in the same range. Singapore and Philippines have fewer newborn females, but the data on Vietnam, if correct, is puzzling. If it were not, say, a hitherto undiscovered medical epidemic in Vietnam causing abnormally high male fetuses with respect to females, it most likely indicates the practice of gender selection in pregnancy, in other words, the abortion of female fetuses. For those who are unfamiliar with Vietnam society, this is anything but normal. Prior to the phase starting around 2000 as shown by the data, there had not been any evidence of common female fetus abortions, or female infanticides or abuse and neglect like those anecdotes in India or China. Also, there has never been pressure for Vietnamese parents to choose between a son or a daughter like the one-child policy in China several decades ago. Lastly, based on Vietnamese cultural anecdotes, it is hard to imagine a level of discrimination against daughters to the magnitude of substantial female fetus abortions as suggested by the data. To put this in another perspective, consider some numbers. Take 2015 as an example. There were 1.6 million babies born. Under normal circumstances, there should have been 778,000 baby girls and 822,000 baby boys. In the actual case, there were 775,000 baby girls and 845,000 baby boys. It is estimated at least 136,000 female fetus pregnancies were terminated. That is 15%, or 1 in 6 parents making a choice in their baby gender. These numbers are not trivial, therefore, questioning the validity and veracity of Vietnam demographics data is well warranted. First, consistency can be checked by comparing the gender discrepancies for the two different data sets, the under 5-year-old group and the newborn. Although there are more males than females at birth, male infants have a slightly higher mortality rate than female, possibly because of genetics, and which may also depend on a country healthcare system. The Vietnam data shows a time delay effect as expected, since a gender disparity at birth will take a few years to gradually show up in the under 5 group. For example, this data point in 2016 is the cumulative effect of all these newborn data in this preceding 5-year range. If so, the roughly 0.25% difference indicates that Vietnam male infants have only a slightly higher mortality rate than female, which is actually a good thing about Vietnam healthcare system, if the data are accurate. In the same vein, again if the data are correct, there has been a trend of gradual gender disparity reduction since 2018, and its effect should be discernible in 2022-2023 data. But there is such a thing as data are too good to be true. Consider the birth rate data of two countries that value accurate statistics, US and Japan. The data are for over a century. Now add the Vietnam birth rate data since 1960. The difference between the Vietnam data and those of US and Japan is the raggedness, or fluctuation of the data. Generally there are two factors for data fluctuations: 1, measurement and human errors, and 2, real-life causal events. Both the US and Japan place a premium on the accuracy of social demographic measurements and data collections. Certainly, there were some small errors here and there, but most fluctuations are from real causes. For example, 1919, are the birth rate dips in both countries coincident? The birth rate drop could have been caused by what had happened in 1918. In 1918, the Spanish flu devastated US, Japan and the entire world, much like the recent COVID-19. The birth rate drops in 1919 in both countries and others in the world were no coincident or random statistical fluctuation. In the 1930s, the US birth rate plunged to the lowest in its history up to that time, as the US was struggling to recover from the Great Depression. Then came 1939 to 1945. After World War II, both the US and Japan saw a baby spike in 1947, approximately 1.5 years after the men returned home. For Japan, that was the peak of its post-war baby boom, and the birth rate went into a sharp decline as Japan men and women were busy coming back to work to rebuild the war-ravaged Japan. The US, on the other hand, enjoyed the peak of post-war prosperity, when the US alone produced half of the world GDP, along with the rise of the American middle class and the birth of the notion of the American dream that fueled a long baby boom. The point is, the data raggedness and fluctuations are not errors, but reflect the historical reality. In fact, the data themselves can actually be used as a metric or a barometer to measure the socio-politico-economic condition and even cultural events of a society. Consider for example Japan. What happened in 1906 and 1966 with a sharp dip in birth rate? These years are known as Hino e Uma, years of the fire horse, and women of that zodiac sign are believed to be evil, and hence girls born on those years are thought to be unmarriageable, and people avoided having children in those years. Notice that Japan had a gap from 1944 to 1946, because its government did not believe it had sufficiently credible statistics in those intense war years. Now, consider the perfectly smooth and completed Vietnam data from 1960 to 1975. Vietnam was largely rural, and the humanitarian condition in those years would not have allowed any credible demographics records, considering the disruption, displacement, and upheaval of the people's normal life activities. Hence, the data are most likely generated from some type of approximation modeling to provide a sort of estimate in lieu of real statistics. It is somewhat perplexing, however, after 1985, a decade after Vietnam had a stable government, that the data are still unnaturally smooth. This is not just one case with the birth data. Consider the death rate for the 5 countries mentioned above. Notice that both US and Germany show a spike in 2020 due to COVID-19. And this is the Vietnam data. Before 1980 or even 1990, it is understandable if the Vietnam death rate data were not available and a model estimate, including the bump of war fatalities, serves as a substitute. However, the Vietnam data are still unnaturally smooth for the episode after 1990 up to 2020. The lack of realistic fluctuations like other data, again like birth data, suggests that what represented are not true demographic measurements but results from perhaps a mathematical model estimation. Every country has a system to record birth and death and issue certificates. If these two most basic vital statistics are not available with accuracy, it raises the question for all other demographics data. This is the reason why it is an issue in this case. It is actually a problem of virtually the entire Vietnam demographics data set from the World Bank, which raises the question how to perform relevant and meaningful analyses of the quote-unquote data. For example, consider this population age group graph from 1960 to 2020. Each column represents the population of an age group, from under 5-year-old, in step of every 5 years, all the way to 80 and above. The top is for female and the bottom is for male population. The median age is the age at which 50% of the population are older and 50% are younger. For example, this shows a woman of 33.6-year-old in 2020 is younger than 50% other women, and also older than the other 50%. The median age for men is slightly less because there are more younger men and more older women, as will be shown later. The demographic dynamic is important to a country planning. Consider new births over the years. The data of the war years and a decade after can be neglected for reasons discussed earlier. But from mid-80s and on, the implication of the baby bust and baby boomlet are too important not to be accurate. It matters to not just the country governance on health, education and social services, but also its economic development and planning for an aging workforce, and commercially, a rapidly changing consumer demographics. After a third of a century conflict, the peacetime baby boom was reaching a crescendo in the mid-80s, and the Vietnam family planning program started to take hold. From 1988 to 1997, with a push for mass acceptance of birth control, 1990 was the peak of Vietnam baby boom and the new birth numbers started to decline along with the birth rate. Even as Vietnam birth rate stabilized since early 2000s, the baby boom generation of the 80s and 90s started to have baby themselves, leading to baby boomlet, with important implication for the future as seen in the cases of US and Japan post-war baby booms and boomlets.